All right, thank you, Sandy. As I said earlier, my name is Paul Boyd. 15 years I've been working at this project. Haven't moved an ounce of sediment yet. I'm hoping to before I retire. That's my goal. Depends on when I move sediment, right? So either tomorrow or when my kids are out of college. So we'll see. But no, Brad and I put this information together for you today to talk a little bit about the background. You know, I think everybody in this room probably knows the general background. Most of you better than I of the history of the project and the reservoir. And then we'll talk about this WRDA, Water Resources Development Act of 2016, the Section 1179A authorization, which talks about sediment management plans on the upper Missouri River Basin, and then how that would be applied, how we would use that framework to develop a plan here, and then Brad will get up here and talk about the planning aspect of it. It would be a planning study and how our goals fit into the planning process and how we would go about executing them. So we'll get started here, and I'm always open for questions. We don't have to queue them all up at the end or something. If you have a question about something I'm presenting, please holler and we'll address it. We're out of the Omaha District, and you can see us right down there. We have, of course, the 6 main stem reservoirs. We have 22 tributary projects, and we also collaborate on management of another 20 to 30 projects with the Bureau of Reclamation within the basin. We're, of course, here at the last end of the main stem cascade. We've got a total of about 0.5% of the total system storage is here in Lewis and Clark Lake. Of the 74 million or so acre feet of storage, we have about 500,000 acre feet or so in this reservoir. The management of the project, the Gavins Point Dam is the project. Lewis and Clark Lake is the impoundment of water behind the project, and there are separate authorized project purposes for 8 different purposes that are supposed to be achieved in harmony and balance with the project. And you can see the list of them. Those are all the public laws that were enacted way back to identify these purposes. One of the continual challenges here on the Missouri River Basin is that there is one project purpose that needs an empty reservoir and 7 project purposes that need a full reservoir. Why you would try and do both of those in the same project? That makes it a little tricky, right? I need empty storage for this one, and I need a full reservoir for the rest of them. So, yeah, Sandy.
As far as flood control, how does the board meet with Lewis and Clark Lake Reservoir?
It is a piece of the total system storage. It is there it's available if we need it for the Niobrara, for an event there. It's available if we need it from the upstream main stem. Of course, it is, again, a very, very small part of the total system storage. You've got that flood risk reduction pool from 1208 to 1210, so you only have 2 feet of flood storage, as we call it, in this reservoir. It's there, and it's able to be used. And in 2010, when we had the event of record on the Niobrara, Lewis and Clark came up 2 feet overnight, and that's exactly what it's there for. But in reference to, say, the delta and the way the delta progrades down the reservoir, I haven't broken it out by pool in this summary table, but I think we've lost about between 10 and 15% of the storage in the exclusive flood pool. So we've lost 10% of that few tenths of a percent of the total system storage. So overall, that's probably, when you're looking at impacted project purposes, that one's on the lesser side right there. But it's still very quantifiable. You can say what that reduction in storage is. Just a reminder on how deltas work. The coarse material all drops out first. That's sand. And the coarser material that's either coming from degradation right below Fort Randall or it's coming out of the Niobrara is all that material that essentially is depositing in the channel from about Lazy River Acres down to past Santee. That's the reach. And a reminder that deltas grow up and down. So while the deltas grow, yeah?
That's a little hypothetical.
Sure.
But if the sedimentation that exists today had not been there, as Don mentioned, there would have been an engineered solution, and so we wouldn't have this sedimentation.
Okay.
Given the flows today, would there still be? Would you still have had the level as high as it is?
Sedimentation?
Would there still be the flooding events like at Lazy River Acres and Mary's Place? And would you still have had to use that much, or has the sedimentation? If
we had sediment management built into the dam, the first caveat there is no sediment management system is perfect, right? We may have designed a system to move a fair bit of it, or most of it, or whatever amount there is there. But if we had a significant reduction from what we have now, sure, you would have probably a likely reduction in stage. That also has to be coupled with the fact that there's the old adage in our business that 90% of sediment moves with 10% of the water, which means your sediment moves with your flood events. And minus a couple that we've had recently over the 50 years of this system, the vast majority of flood events have been taken out of the equation, and those are usually what moves sediment. So if you reduce the sediment in the system, you reduce it some, but the other balancing factor is you've also reduced the number of large runoff events that used to move whatever amount of sediment there is in the system down the river. So yeah, there would be a reduction in these increased stages if we had reduced sediment. But there's multiple factors in there of trying to figure out exactly how much that reduction would be. Okay. So as this delta forms here, we have that visible delta down just past Santee. There is also 4 or 5 feet of fine material on the bottom of the reservoir that goes all the way down to the spillway. You don't see that because it's under 30 feet of water, but it does. That is a measurable and significant piece of the total volume change in the reservoir. One of the things that makes Lewis and Clark unique is that the very visible delta we have because of how shallow the reservoir was right up there at Springfield. As an example, we have a delta at Oahe that doesn't look nearly as big as it does down here, and it collects 4 times as much sediment. Okay, so a lot of it has to do with a perception and the existing geology we have in the system. And so if we go and look at the summary, these are the most recent numbers we have, the most recent surveys on those main stems. I know Sandy has put this in a number of MSAC materials. We were at 26% of the total storage. That's from the top of the flood control pool down. It's flood control pool, multi-purpose pool, carryover pool, permanent pool, all from the bottom all the way up to elevation 1210. We've lost about 26%. And that survey was done late fall, right after the 2011 flood. And at the long-term rate is a little over 0.5% per year over the last 60 years. So you could do the math, we're somewhere around 30%.
And the open lake when it was created was 25 miles, and what would you say is?
It was 25 miles to roughly a mile past Springfield, and I think we're somewhere between 16 and 17 miles of open lake before you have to start working your way through the cattails and the lake there. And you can see some of those other equivalents, 2,600 acre feet per year. It is the smallest of the annual storage loss numbers in there. We recently did a rack and stack at headquarters in the climate preparedness and vulnerability community of practice, and our district got 2 of the top 10. So when they put all the metrics with them of storage loss and vulnerability, both Gavins Point and Fort Randall are in the Corps' top 10 priorities for reservoir sedimentation. Yeah, Mary.
Paul, at what percentage would you consider a crisis, or do you already?
The state of Nebraska considers a water body impacted at, is it 25%? I forget the number there. I'm talking to them. And I think, Mary, that's a question that kind of applies to what topic. If we kind of break it down by project purpose, if the question is hydropower and re-regulation for downstream, it's not 25%. We can operate for a lot of the benefits with much less than that. If you're talking about the water intakes for BY and Cedar Knox, and you're talking about access at Santee, and you're talking about water stages at Niobrara, most people would contend that number is clearly less than 26%, right? But I think that's probably kind of a benefit by benefit question, and we have certain ones that are definitely impacted now, and we have other project purposes that have a fairly long benefit horizon still in them.
So one follow-up on that, I think there are some water systems that they feel comfortable right now, but is there any way to predict how channels might change? Can someone feel comfortable in that their water intake's okay now? Is it going to be okay 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Is that something that's planned to look at, or is it something that...
Well, yes, certainly. And as one of them is looking at the historical trends and doing kind of a long-term assessment of what we think the delta is going to do and how quickly it's going to move. And unfortunately, we have a lot of data. We've been surveying the reservoir since 1955 at closure. And so I know we've had discussions in our office with some of the folks, and Annette and I have talked a number of times about what the bottom of the reservoir looks like. Is there a better place or a worse place to put an intake? Do you need to get out to a channel? In front of the delta, there is no more channel at the bottom of the reservoir. It's pretty much a flat bottom because all those fines that come past the sand, they've all filled in the bottom of the reservoir. So laterally, north to south, the Nebraska versus the South Dakota side, probably not a difference there. The question is, how far downriver do I need to be away from the delta if I want to get another 50 years of use out of my intake? And those are things we've worked on. We've kind of estimated that the front edge of it moves about 500 feet per year. And if you need 40 years out of it, you probably ought to be about down here to be safe. So.
Like Springfield, and so far so good. Is there?
Once those channels have really the major channels on both sides have kind of established themselves 30, 40 years ago, we haven't seen a whole lot of change in those. Some of those channels that kind of weave through the middle of the delta, we saw a little bit of change in those in 2011 when we had real high pools in there. But the well-established channels along both sides of the reservoir, we expect to generally stay there.
Might be way into the future when those channels might change, or at some point sediment might start going over. Is that?
In general, I would say that when you get much closer to the dam and you run out of storage area for sediment, there is the possibility that they would start to backfill. But you do have all the river flow kind of prioritized in those two channels. And unless there was a drastic change in sediment load, which we don't see on the near horizon, I would expect that those two channels will probably stay reasonably stable, the bigger of the channels there. Main stem reservoir changes in reservoir storage capacity. This is just a kind of another graphic that gives you a relative comparison of volume here, of what's going on in the system. Now, if we look at how the reservoirs were designed in this system, there's hundreds of thousands of dams all over the world, so there are hundreds of thousands of dam designs all over the world. Each one's built a little bit different than the other. In the case of Gavins Point Dam, how was sediment addressed in the design? There was an estimate made of the annual inflow of sediment into the system based on the location that the dam was put. And then there was a volume allocated of the storage of the reservoir to trap and permanently hold that sediment. Most of these designs were never built on a sediment design life. They were built on an economic design life to return the benefits over either a 50 or 100-year economic life. And in the case of all the Missouri River, we've generally exceeded our 50-year economic life. So we're now in kind of a uncharted territory for the long-term sustainable economics of reservoirs. What does that mean to us now? And many of ours have not included any sort of low-level outlets or flushing tunnels is a term you often hear. Don was right. Generally across the world now, almost all dams are put in with some sort of sediment management structure in them, either a bypass channel or off-channel storage or a set of tunnels at the bottom of the reservoir where you can drain the reservoir and flush sediments right out the bottom to the river below. That is not the case here. The spillway would be the primary discharge location for any sediment. Because of course sediment in the powerhouse is a big no-no. So the only practical pathway is over the spillway or around or over or under or whatever. And that spillway is approximately 30 feet off the bottom of the reservoir. So even if you got sediment down there, you're filling in a hole below the spillway with sediment before you would have any that would come over the spillway. So that is a design quirk that certainly has to be taken into consideration when looking at any sediment management plan. How would you do this? How was sediment yield from the watershed determined? Those folks back there in the 1940s with slide rules and pencils did a pretty good job of estimating what was going to happen here, and you can look, we've culled the information from the old design memorandums for when the dams were designed, and we matched them up with our surveys here. And you can look at our Gavins Point, Lewis and Clark Lake there. The long-term average that we're getting is remarkably close to what is identified in the original 1940s design memoranda from what they expected out of the watershed. Yeah, Don.
Tell us a little bit about the methodology of the model behind those numbers. The reason I ask that question, there's such a wide variability as to the rate of sedimentation, whether you're talking Lazy River acres or Brazil Creek or Woodard Creek or Cattail City out here by the bridge.
Right.
So, but isn't this the 30,000 foot
Sure.
model?
This is simply taking the estimated numbers out of the design memorandum and comparing them to our surveyed volumes every decade. And the point you just brought up plays exactly to the footnote on the bottom there. All of those places you just mentioned are not in the pool of the reservoir, right? And there is significant, these numbers do not include anything outside of the normal maximum pool, the top of the flood control pool as identified. And so we can say, we can say that the lake itself is filling in about at the rate they estimated, but there weren't any estimates made of the sedimentation above each of these reservoirs, and we've quantified that too. We don't have anything old to compare it to, but we know what the volume is, and we know that aggradation extends from the lake all the way up to Lazy River Acres and all the way about 15 miles up the Niobrara. And the impacts of, not specifically sedimentation, but the pool have impacts for 10 miles up Bazille Creek and Ponca Creek and below Randall. So those are things that, that sediment that's not deposited in the lake is not considered in this figure, but we do understand that is part of the greater system and would be considered. We have a lot of flexibility in this sediment management plan as it's written in the section authorization. It doesn't say it has to be just the footprint of the project. It says it has to consider sediments that impact the project. That gives us the flexibility to say Bazille Creek up the Niobrara, all the way up to Lazy River Acres or all the way up to Fort Randall. So, yeah.
Could you give me a 30-second snapshot of where the Water Development Resources Act is in Congress today? And is anybody in the Corps handicapping its eventual passage?
No.
You can't do that?
I cannot do that. I have no idea. Brad, there's a 2019 WRDA, isn't it? Working through.
It's being worked on, and I believe
sitting committee right now.
It's gone through both the House and Senate version, and the president signed it.
Okay.
Yeah, on the appropriations, right? And then the authorization bill is being, I think, worked by the conference of both House and Senate. So yeah, both. I'll talk about both here in just a few minutes.
Okay, good.
Is there anything in that one that
I'm not tracking anything specific
that applies to this?
To it necessarily, but there might be some details I'm not even up on. But yeah.
All right. So these are some old pictures, and I think many of you have seen these. So we kind of use Springfield as a reference point. This is pre-dam with the river, and then 1964 when we had the open water just past Springfield. By 1982, Santee's over here, Springfield's right here. See the delta moving along the South Dakota bank, and then continuing out into the deeper part of the lake, 1998, 2016. So we've got past the wider spot there, and we're getting back into a narrower spot. The trade-off there, we're getting into a narrower reach of the reservoir. Every year we also get to a deeper area of the reservoir. When we closed at Springfield, I don't know the exact numbers, but a lot of that lake at the very top there was only a few feet deep. And now that we've moved from, open water up here, this 7 miles or so down here, right off the face here, we've got more 10 to 12 foot deep water. And as the delta continues to prograde into the reservoir, it's got to fill a deeper and deeper and deeper lake. So even without any change in the rate, you will actually see the visible delta slow down. Because instead of filling a 6 foot deep reservoir, it's filling a 16 foot deep reservoir. Well, it's going to take more material to pile it up to. Doesn't mean things have changed. Very well may be the same loss rate. We may still be losing the storage at the same rate. But visibly that delta may appear to slow down as we move farther towards the reservoir. There's some of the historical curves, and as we looked at it, this is what I was alluding to with the net when we talked. Based on our leading edge at the surface, about 500 feet per year, and the slope of that sand delta as it moves out into the lake, we can make some general estimates of where we might see the edge of that delta. And I know that's hard to see in the back. This is a line for 2015. Which is about right where it was, and then another estimate out here at 2035. Those are very basic rudimentary estimates based on historical imagery and surveys we have. So what is the magnitude of the sediment? How much sediment are we dealing with here? So this was a table that was done back when we did a sediment strategies report, a reconnaissance study in 2001. And just yesterday I updated it to the new numbers. The new long-term average we saw was 2,600 acre feet a year. That's a little over 4 million cubic yards a year in this lake. So if we wanted to get some simple numbers there, and we can put 10 yards of material in a dump truck, I need 1,200 dump trucks a day. That's a truck by here every 45 seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Or I can have a couple of big hopper trains, or I can put 12 large Missouri River navigation barge units full of sediment every day. And we also worked it out. I said, I don't own a big truck. I don't own a train. I sure don't own a barge, but I own a pickup truck. And I figured out I can put about 3/4 of a yard of sediment in my pickup truck, 1,500 pounds or so. And then I figured out that a pickup truck's about 20 feet long. So if I take that on an annual basis and I line them up around the equator of the Earth, I get about 90% of the way around the Earth with a row of pickup trucks full of sand in the bed of each one. So sometimes we get to meetings and occasionally folks will say, well, if you just pile it up on the side, get it out of the way of the river. And I'm confident most of the folks in here have experience with the river. You understand how much sediment we're talking about. It's a little, sediment deltas are very much like icebergs. You only see the 10% of it at the surface. The vast majority of it is moving along the reservoir bottom.
I have one hypothetical. In order to use barges for some purpose, is this, do you have to get it to Sioux City or how?
Of course, right. We don't have a federally authorized navigation channel above the mouth of the Big Sioux at River 734, River Mile 734. So, yeah, the barge idea is clearly hypothetical because the barges are 670 miles from here. But yeah, that would certainly be a limitation. And then, as Don was mentioning earlier, what about that sediment all above the reservoir? There's the example. This is the Niobrara gauge. It's right on the Missouri River, and over the course of 1960-ish to 2000, right before the flood, those stage discharges went up by 8 feet, right? All directly due to that sedimentation that's happening. And that's sedimentation that is outside the reservoir, right? That's in the Missouri River, not in Lewis and Clark Lake. We did get a significant adjustment during the 2011 flood. That is by no means justification for the flood, right? That's a convenient outcome of it, but certainly not worth the damage that was caused. But if we look at those stages now, we're back about where we were in 1990. However, those stages will continue to climb again. And all the gauges above the reservoir look like this. All the gauges below the reservoir look the other way, right? Their channel is degrading. Those water surfaces are down by 10 feet. These water surfaces are up by 10 feet. So that being said, that we know about the reservoir here. What is this word of Section 1179A, and what does it mean to us here in this room? This is just a snapshot of the document as signed by Congress, and it talks about here. 1179 is the Missouri River, and Section A is Reservoir Sediment Management. And it talks specifically about developing reservoir sediment management plans. And congratulations to whoever of you in this room got this into WRDA and got it approved. The best we can tell, it was a surprise to us that it showed up in there and the phone started ringing. And the best we can tell is Senator Barrasso's office from Wyoming has some concern about both some core and some reclamation reservoirs in Wyoming. And there was a press release on his office's website heralding the passing of this. So it is in here, and it talks about sediment management plans, and it identifies plan elements and setting up basin pilot program, and we'll kind of go through these in a little more detail here. It was signed into law in December of 2016, and Corps of Engineers headquarters developed implementation guidance. That is the document that Brad's office uses to stand up and build a project that meets the goals of the authorization. And all of our implementation guidance is published on the Corps of Engineers website. So that is public record, and you can see exactly what interpretation was made by our headquarters and what it means to the project. So let's go through a few key points on the authorization. We'll talk about the authorization first. That was the one that went through and was approved by Congress and everybody. And then we'll look at a few points from implementation, which is the interpretation of the authorization by Corps of Engineers headquarters. The authorization calls for development of a sediment management plan as means of preventing sediment from reducing water storage capacity at a reservoir, increasing water storage capacity through sediment removal at a reservoir, and carry out a pilot program for the development and implementation of sediment management plans for reservoirs owned and operated by the Corps in the upper Missouri River Basin. Oop, I missed an R there. On request by project beneficiaries. A sediment management plan shall, this is what it says right in the authorization, it shall provide opportunities for stakeholders to participate in the management decisions. It'll evaluate the volume. What do we already know about the reservoir? What are the current conditions? What are the past conditions? It will identify preliminary sediment management options. It will also identify the constraints that go with those options, assess technical feasibility, economic justification, and environmental impacts, identify beneficial uses. The Corps has had a beneficial use of dredge material program for many, many years, but this one is good for us in that it doesn't specifically say dredge material. It says beneficial uses of sediment, however they might be moved or relocated or whatever. And then use, develop, and demonstrate innovative cost-saving technologies to manage sediment, which is a call to build a better mousetrap, find a smarter, cheaper, faster way to do this. And to that end, we are partnering with the Bureau of Reclamation right now on a public challenge question, and if you can figure out a way to move sediment out of the reservoir cheaper than any current technology, the Bureau of Reclamation will write you a check for $75,000 tomorrow. So there you go, Don. You got an idea? Don't tell it to me. You got to write it up.
Before, but people treat me like I'm HIV positive.
Yeah, put it in there.
We moved plenty of sediment in a different river, half a world away, 40 years ago. It was in the Mekong River.
Mm-hmm. We still do.
And as I said several years ago, one word, artillery.
There you go.
When the gentleman I suggested it to looked at me like I was from Mars, I said, wait a minute, isn't the word army on the sign above your door? My point is not so much that we literally fire artillery in the riverbed, but that by properly placed mechanical means can move sediment from one turn to the other. But the Corps is imprisoned by conventional wisdom where NEPA and everything else is in the way. So it's up to groups like us to come with these out-of-the-box thoughts and suggestions and work and at least get some examination.
Sure.
I think part of what needs to be involved in that discussion is the cheapest way to invest in it, especially when you have stakeholders involved and we all have different benefits or things that you want to see happen as a result. So I think we have to work with him recently, and I accept that.
Sure, and that's I think why that asks in there for innovative and creative solutions, and in a number of the modeling studies we've done, we have simulated essentially using bulldozer, with a drawdown flush, using bulldozers to supplement that and increase the amount of sediment we're delivering into that channel, and all of that. So yeah, that's. And part of that will play in a little. I've got a slide a little later on reservoir economics, and the old design cost analysis, the design life analysis works quite well for a lot of civil works projects. Reservoirs are kind of an oddball in that system, and they don't really because they decay at a rate that other civil works projects may not. And so we'll talk about design life versus lifecycle economics on reservoirs, and if that's a way to justify sediment action to preserve future economic benefits instead of letting them decline and essentially go to zero. This is the implementation guidance. This was the guidance as written by our headquarters that we follow in a study here. They define the upper Missouri River Basin as the Missouri River above Sioux City, Iowa. So we could implement one of these plans through a study at any reservoir above Sioux City, Iowa. And there is a provision there for us to collaborate with Reclamation, Bureau of Reclamation on any dams they have. Benefits may be economic and ecological, both direct and indirect. Sediment plan will follow engineering regulation guidance. That's a well-established ER we've been using for decades. The max project is 3 years, $3 million. And if implementation of a sediment plan is recommended by the study, a report will be reviewed by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and construction appropriations can be requested under a new start. That is one of the things that makes 1179 a little different than some of the other planning tools we have, in that it clearly calls out if there is a recommendation, you can move forward towards implementation under this authorization. We have lots of other study authorizations that provide a study, and at the end of the study, the product is the study. In this case here, if this, based on environmental and other benefits and economic benefits and all of that, if there is an action that is justified by the study, then you are in a position under 1179 to turn that into a proposal to implement it.
I have a question.
Yep.
In this plan, do you have to take into consideration the impact of what happens downstream, like your navigation and your delta?
We will, yes. That is not specifically called out, and again, as we said, it's very broad, and that's a good thing that it is very broad. But in general, when we have considered in the past, and we would do this again in the future, when we look at sedimentation at Lewis and Clark Lake, we look at the lower Niobrara and then essentially Fort Randall to past Sioux City. When we get to Sioux City, we're in the Federal Navigation Channel with a lot higher velocities. That channel is still degrading, which tells us it has a lot of capacity for sediment that is untapped, and it may be able to handle more. But certainly that that is a big concern to the bank stabilization folks and the water intake folks and everybody else downriver. It's not just a reservoir problem, and we realize that when we're talking these volumes of sediment, your primary transport mode is the river below the dam, and when you bring that into the discussion, you bring flood risk, increased flood risk. Down there, infrastructure impacts, navigation impacts, likely all the way to the mouth at St. Louis. Now, I don't want to imply that a study would track every particle of sediment to St. Louis, but certainly when we look at technologies that have a puncher's chance here, we would also want to look at the estimated volume that we could move, and then what we think those impacts might be. And the idea of a plan here is to identify a couple of technologies and generally put together what their impacts are, what their benefits are. And then the recommendation out of this may be that we say, here's two things that would work if we can get all the pieces to line up just right. And then we'd look for an implementation project to do the design and the assessment and the NEPA and all that kind of stuff. Mary.
Paul, you were talking about pickups and barges. What is a barge load of sand worth in the world market in 2018?
In this part of the world, nothing. St. Louis, New Orleans, maybe something different. We're in a neck of the world where sand is essentially free. And if the sand hills right here, where it's all coming from, there is certainly discussion that at New Orleans there is significant value because of the bed degradation and the loss of coastal barrier islands for hurricane protection. I mean, you can get 6 degrees of connection here to some really significant benefits to that sediment in the right place. One of our big obstacles right now is we're a long, long way from those places where we have a significant economic value to it. We have established Kansas City, they mine sediment out of the river. Up in the Omaha District here, we haven't permitted that, but all of our sand and gravel is right off the channel type of stuff. So I don't know, and Sandy and I have had this discussion, and we've talked to the county, and who needs sand? We'd gladly find a way to give it away if somebody wants it. The trick is finding, that USGS did an assessment of this sand as a fracking proppant, essentially fracking sand for North Dakota. And their assessment was that it is a mid-level sand, and with some manipulation and some additives to it, it could be a useful product in fracking. The downside is there is also a useful product another 600 miles closer to North Dakota. And so until a source like that is exhausted and they can justify the expense of bringing it from here, it really doesn't hold an economic value there yet. Doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to look for those opportunities. And that would be part of this. We need to do a deeper dive on that. The benefits corresponding to the cost of the sediment management will be assigned to various reservoir purposes. Brad will talk a little bit about this. That's a new approach that we have to attempt to assign what reservoir purposes get the benefits from sediment management. And then we'll use the knowledge through the pilot program to develop guidance for sediment management at other reservoirs. To our knowledge, this is the first WRDA authorization that specifically calls out sediment management plans with a goal of enacting something to make a positive impact at a reservoir, and it just happens to be in this district right here. We've got some folks in other districts that I work with, which are very, very interested in what happens here because they'd like to see a similar type of authorization to work with in their area. So if we apply that to Lewis and Clark Lake, what do we already know? Well, we've got extensive surveys. We've done RSM, Regional Sediment Management Programs, looking at all the sources in the Niobrara River. We have that reconnaissance report that did some basic economics and looked at some methodologies, options back in 2001. We have a great deal of data from the downstream as part of below the dam as part of the Emergent Sandbar Habitat Program. And I've been personally involved for the last 5 or 6 years on extensive modeling, hydraulic and sediment transport modeling that's been supported by the recovery program. Its primary goal, the recovery program, primarily wanted the answer to know if we could get sediment and specifically sand below the dam for the sandbars. That was the goal, but what it does is you have to build a flushing model of the reservoir and a sediment transport model to see what will happen. So part of what Sandy was talking about, not getting scared off by 3 years, $3 million, is the fact that the recovery program over the last decade has funded a lot of these things. And there's millions of dollars of work that's already been done. which either through very slight modification or can be directly used as support for different consideration of different methodologies, management parts of this plan. We're working on a dredging technologies report. And then we, of course, have all those, as Don said, all those thousands of reports on every creek and every drop of sand and every drop of water over the past 60 years. So I think we're in a great position here because as we go out and I work with my cohorts around the Corps, we have much more data than a lot of other places do, and that is definitely to our benefit in this idea. So a framework here, if I go through these 6 bullets again, provide opportunities for stakeholders, scoping input from the sponsors and the public, process reports with the opportunity to learn from what we've already put in there, and through updates say, you know what, we're going down somewhere that's not going to play out. Let's put some more of our effort over here. Evaluate volume and sediment and storage. The good news is that's not a very expensive lift in this study. A lot of that's already been done. At this point, while I would love a new survey of the lake, that's not part of what we've looked at in a budget as part of this study. Identify preliminary sediment management options. We've got a couple slides on this later, so I won't read those. And identify constraints. An action that benefits the mouth of the Niobrara may not benefit Yankton. Okay, and we'll blow out some sand here at the mouth of the Niobrara and bury the Cedar Knox water intake. Well, come on here, everybody may have the overall large goal of rebalancing sediment in the system, but we do have to be very aware that there are localized impacts that we do have to address. And it's completely honest to say that you're never going to completely mitigate all the impacts. We have impacts now with the way the system is. We have impacts to water intakes and recreation and water supply. We've lost a little bit of storage and all that kind of stuff. But we have to be realistic. If we don't want those impacts, we are likely going to have to trade those for a few other impacts to make this happen. If we change the management paradigm, we are also going to change the impacts paradigm. So there is no likely way to enact a management change here and take all impacts to zero. We will have that discussion of what impacts are we trading for other impacts. And then where does the sediment go? We talked about how much sediment it is and what to do with it. The most obvious place as a receiving stream is the Missouri River below the dam. That doesn't mean that's the only place. We would certainly consider if there were off-stream options. Those kind of go into the creative solutions we look at. Where are all the places we could put it? What are the benefits we could get out of it? And if we can't find those, what are the impacts of putting it in the river? And so following up on that, on those sediment management options, we generally break those into 3 groups. Okay? We either minimize the sediment coming in, we react to it, or we find a sustainable solution to manage it. So you either keep it from coming in, you keep it going after it's already coming in, or you have to remove it after it stops. And this is my cohort, John Shelley from the Kansas City districts, likes that whack-a-mole, the game you played as a kid where you hit it at one location, you hit the mole and it pops up at another, and then you hit it over there and it pops up at another, and you hit it at third place, it pops up again. Okay? Those are those reacting to sediment accumulation and just solving a very local problem and piling the sand up over here where it may still be in the system and it may still have a long-term impact. And doing those does not create a sustainable system that we're looking for. In graphical terms, you can kind of break that down into these different colors. The green ones on there are ways to keep sediment from getting into your reservoir in the first place. Let's see, the yellow ones, bypass tunnels, current venting, diversion weirs. Those are ways to keep it moving once it's coming in. If you've got sediment coming in down the river, instead of letting it deposit in the reservoir, how do we just keep it moving, get it around or get it through and keep it going on down the river? And then those blue ones are what do we do when that sediment's already in the reservoir? And we're certainly in a combination of all three of these in the watershed. We have significant load coming into the reservoir, we have significant load that wants to go through the reservoir, and we have a significant amount of sediment already deposited in the reservoir. So we have all three of those, but this is just a graphical explanation of some of those, and it was nicely summed up by one of our cohorts in all these different, you don't have to read all of these, but the point here is that there are a lot of technologies out there to manage sediment that work in different hydrologic regimes, different shapes and sizes of reservoirs, different climates, and all of that. And when we say in that management study that we would evaluate different methodologies, we'd certainly start with this type of flow chart, and we'd work our way through all these different methodologies. Certainly, there's ones that nope, that won't work. Turbidity current venting is a way of moving sediment through a real steep mountain stream when you have volcanic sediments that essentially form this pudding, and they flush and they move right down the bottom of the reservoir. And the last time I checked, we're not volcanic, and we're not a steep mountain stream. And so probably that one's not going to probably make the list. But there are a lot of things in there: erosion control, stream bank control, headwater structures, bypass, drawdown, flushing, pass-through, excavation, dredging, redistributing reallocating the pool, hydraulic excavation. All of those have a chance of some modicum of success, and that would be looked at as part of those actions. And so continuing on, excess technical feasibility, that was we were just talking about, an economic justification for a project under the old benefit cost ratio, right? The benefit has to be more than $1 for your cost. That works when you build a reservoir and you take the 50-year future and you bring that back to the current day value, because it's just pennies on the dollar. But that model essentially waits for your benefits to decline until the point where you can say the cost of the management is more than the loss of the benefit. And that is a little hard to do right now. It's a lot easier to do when your hydropower is impacted or regulation to navigation is impacted, that type of thing. But that is a reactionary economic model. It waits until there is a loss of benefit or value, and then you say, when the value drops enough, it makes it cost effective to take an action to manage it. The benefit, that's kind of called the design life model. And the one that is being more embraced right now is what we call lifecycle economics. I'm very interested in it, and a lot of the folks who work in reservoir management are interested in it. It is not an official cost process, used by the Corps at this time. But we have talked about with our economists, including a chapter that discusses life cycle economics, because life cycle takes into the fact that you have benefits every year that you are protecting. If I get $10 million a year of benefits, recreation, hydropower, add them all up, what is it worth to maintain $10 million of benefit every year into the future, forever? If I do something now, if I take a sediment management action right now and I spend some money right now, can I maintain my $10 million of benefits for the next 100 years? Well, with the time growth of money, 100 years, 100 times 10, we got lots of billions of dollars, right? You're talking about of preserved benefits in the future, which aren't taken into account in design life. You wait until you've lost the benefit, and then you take an action that's economically advantageous to regain it. And I think, as we all know, is going to the doctor for checkups, the old an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we look at 100 years of benefits to maintain this project, and I'm quite confident that our guys are, Tom and Gary will still be here in 100 years turning the knobs over there. I fully expect that, right? Okay, I got nodding from those guys. So they'll be there for the next 100 years. So we need to make sure that the reservoir is still working, still providing benefits in 100 years. So that's the idea of life cycle economics on that, and that's something I would hope we would consider. Yeah.
The economics, that would be great. Is there a way to also consider something like Highway 12? They just had a meeting on that again this week.
So I think that falls into, and I forget which slide it was, there was a slide under the economic justification of using direct and indirect benefits. And so I think there, it's easy to use the narrative of look of what we've already spent on sediment management over the years, and here's what we're planning to spend on sediment management to maintain infrastructure and all of that. I do not expect, and nor would I, champion the idea of this plan replacing Highway 12. I think we have actions we need to take right now to do that because we are on a longer game here. But absolutely. So the indirect benefits are we spent millions of dollars on the emergent sandbar habitat program below Gavins Point. If you find a solution and we can move sand every year, do you need that program? Or can you reduce that program? Are those dollars better spent somewhere else? And those are the kind of things, if we look at all those indirect benefits, that all of a sudden make this cost that we might spend on this a little more palatable. I mean, we shouldn't kid ourselves. These are big numbers. They're big, big numbers. But we do spend a fair number of other dollars, protecting ourselves or reacting to sedimentation in the reach. And those should be considered that if you can come up with a reasonably sustainable management plan, can you say, we're going to spend this much, but look at the other dollars we no longer need to spend? Those are considerations too. Identify beneficial uses, and then again, demonstrate innovative cost-saving technologies, and address the impact of climate uncertainty in the future. As we drove up here today, and it's like 47 degrees. Weather is very uncertain. It was 94 yesterday in Omaha. But, we just look at, it's going to be a bad hurricane year and all of that. And whatever model you look at, there is certain uncertainty in the way we model weather and future climate changes. And many of those models, predict in this part of the world about the same amount of rain over the next 100 years on an annual basis, but it may come in shorter, more intense rainstorms. Well, if that's the case, we know that those intense rainstorms are the ones that drive erosion off the watershed. So we could very well have the same amount of runoff that we've had 50 years from now, but the amount of sediment we're introducing to the river changes. And those are things we need to consider is if we do a plan, how flexible is the plan in the implementation? Is it scalable? Can we move more sediment if we need to in the future based on what our plan is, or is our plan fixed and it does X when you do Y and you get Z type of thing? So those are some of the considerations there. And then I'll revisit this cost of reservoir sediment management quickly, talking about that design life versus life cycle. And some of these, costs that we talk about, we have to compare the management to the benefits lost. That's the life cycle part of things. And watershed solutions usually have a fixed cost. If we're going to put in sediment trapping dams, or we're going to do land improvements, or we're going to do watershed augmentation, we can assign $1 to that and a lifespan of that. Solutions that keep sediment moving may have no direct cost, but the cost of lost benefits. This is the one that comes up often the time if you're talking about something like flushing a reservoir. What is the cost of flushing the reservoir? Well, in a very simple vacuum, it's zero because you open the gates and you let it go. But we all know that we lose hydropower production during that time. We lose accessibility to water supplies. We lose recreation, the marinas, all the other benefits of the reservoir are temporarily suspended when we take that management action. So those are kind of those indirect costs and benefits that we need to account for when looking at our management actions. Just looking at a rough number as we kind of pencil in these expenses for dredging, if we take that roughly 4.3 million cubic yards of sediment, and most of our long-range pumping, coastal pumping systems that move sediment 10 to 20 miles are in the $10 to $20 per cubic yard. We took information from what the New Orleans district does for navigation and coastal nourishment pumping in long run. And even if you got it at $10 a yard, right? There's $50 million. Okay, and that $4.3 million a year is that 4.3 million cubic yards. That's an annual rate. That's not the total of what's in the reservoir. That's what comes in every year. So if you're going to dredge it and pump it and put it down in the river, 50 million a year, every year, forever, I mean, that's not a sustainable solution, hence why we're looking at everything else. So, yeah.
What's the average amount of revenue generated by the
power plant?
Electrical at Yankee? Yeah.
Tom?
Probably about 20, maybe 15.
Million?
Yeah, a year? Yeah. So yeah, and if you're doing that, $500,000 a week type of thing, something like that, if we take it offline for a month to do some sort of sediment action, we have to take that into account. We've got $1 million of lost revenue right there. If the trade-off is that you can get the other 11 months of hydropower for the next 100 years instead of the next 50, well, then the math's in your favor. But that certainly has to be considered. Yeah, Don?
Paul, in your research, did you ever contact anyone at the Loop Public Power District in Monroe? Because they have essentially a year-round permanent dredging operation.
I know of the system. I have not been in contact with them. I know the Loop River is active in selling sediments up north, and so we know one of the managers over there, and I think that's one of the pieces as we do the background and look for ways to monetize the product. That would certainly be one of the priority calls right there. This is all I have. I apologize for it taking longer than it probably should have. Yeah.
Last thing.
Sure.
I guess in looking at all this, what makes it more complex is that we do have more than one authorized purpose or two that we're trying to.
Correct. Yes.
If we're like looking in China, maybe it's easier for them because they don't have recreation for that reservoir or whatever other uses. So is that, I think that's what this Section 1179A will take into account, especially with the stakeholders' participation, is that, if we had different gates at Gavins Point, you probably wouldn't be operating it for recreation then.
If you had different gates at Gavins Point, we probably would have designed it with different, that would be because there were different project goals to start with, right? And I think that's what you're getting at. So what the design does is it tries to balance and provide generally the maximum level of benefits on all those project purposes. Get the most you can out of all of them instead of blatantly sacrificing one for the other. And you're right in the cases where, we're doing work on a couple of dams in Laos and Myanmar. And they're very limited. Their purpose is hydropower, and only hydropower. No recreation, no water quality, none of those other. You can take our other 7 off the list. The purpose is hydropower. They have a hydropower galley. They have structures that divert the bedload sediment over to a set of gates that flushes it almost constantly. And they pull clean water off the galley for a hydropower system that they run 24 hours a day. So they built sediment management into the system to essentially have the sediment bypass the hydropower system. But that's because they have to provide no other services or benefits of the project. And I don't expect that Congress is going to change our project purposes in the near future. And so at this best, you look for a compromise that tries to preserve maximum benefits for the greatest number of those project purposes. So, all right, I'm going to switch it over to Brad here, who's going to talk about the interesting stuff. Yes. The financials and the different projects we have. Oh, yeah, take that, and I will switch you. Put that in your pocket.
Slide link scan stack?
Yes, I will. These are PDF, but I'll write. These are in PowerPoint. I'll write this to PDF and email it the same to you guys can post it on the exact site. Okay.
All right. I am Brad Thompson. I am the chief of our planning branch, and so we work on studies. I mean, that's one of the things that we do is provide a justification. That's part of the requirements. Is if you're going to do a project or implement something, someone's done the homework. Looked at benefit cost analysis, looked at impacts, those sorts of things. But I'm not sure if we got to the interesting stuff or not. Hopefully you guys can hang through this because I'm basically going to talk about authorizations and funding, right? The kind of the how-to, what are the practical realities, and certainly this 1179A is one of those. So we'll cover a little bit more than that as well. What the question came up, or word has been referred to a couple times, and so that is the Water Resources Development Act. And actually, every once in a while, it uses slightly different names, but it's basically an authorizing bill that primarily directs the Corps, the Bureau of Reclamation on water projects that they're authorized to do, have permission to do. So it's covering things like the list there: flood risk management, navigation, ecosystem, water supply. And of course, 1179 was added to sediment. It covers a variety of things, water resource based. And in general, it's either setting up or providing further clarifications on things like the policies those agencies follow, programs that they might be able to implement, and even to the named specific projects. And so that's kind of generally what's covered. It comes out approximately every other year. There's been times where that's not been the case, but recently it really is almost every other year, and it is being worked on right now. And so the House and Senate have versions of those, and as I understand, I believe they're in conference, and those details are being sorted out.
I did get some updates on this. So it passed the House, and it's in front of the Senate. They just need to find a floor time to pass it, hopefully the next coming weeks to pass the Senate for the authorization.
So yeah, this slide, sometimes we're quite a ways away from action, but both these things have been moving. Thanks for that update. So at the bottom here, I got the authorized permissions. So that's the one that's on the move right currently. The House has passed a version. The Senate is going to work on it. As I'm tracking, though, I'm not tracking any real specific details related to this. No proposed amendments to 1179A or anything. But it is just kind of for reference. The other one is the appropriations funding. And so for the Corps of Engineers agencies, you basically have the money that is appropriated in that current fiscal year. And so that also has been on the move this past week, where the House and Senate passed. Energy and water is actually clumped in with a few other things this year, but so that's, I believe, on its way to the president's desk. So the Congress has done their work on that. So that's just a little bit of background. I mean, so there's specifics to it. You have to have an authority, like a permission to go to do a study or implement a project, and you have to have the funding to go with it. And so this kind of just, hopefully the logic is here on the order. I maybe switched up a couple of the questions that had Sandy listed. I just also wanted to back up just a little bit about what kind of programs does the Corps have and implement. And so just kind of broadly, we provide things as simple as technical assistance, which wouldn't necessarily lead to construction. And so we're going to talk a little bit about planning assistance to states. We have a floodplain management services. Anyway, there's some programs that just kind of help us provide technical assistance. And then we have other programs that allow planning, design, and construction, where you can actually go out and build things. So we'll talk a little bit about those. One useful reference, I think your group probably has this a little bit already, but like different than some agencies are really set up and they provide grants. And so there's a certain time of year where you put in for the grant.
the Corps of Engineers, we've been set up to do cost-shared studies, provide technical expertise, but we really are going to go places where there's a local partner and interest, and we work together with them on that and on a cost-shared basis. And again, so that basically for us to move forward with anything, it requires both a federal and a local interest to advance it. So just kind of talking through some of the specifics or types of ways for things to go. We have a program it's called the General Investigation. That's part of the funds that's in that appropriation bill for the Corps of Engineers, but it allows studies. And generally I call this specifically authorized. So these are specific projects in specific places. And so one of the reasons I'm bringing it up is 1179A would fall under that. It's a specific program and so to be funded, it would be studied under the General Investigations funding. And so just a couple of the details of how that works is, and I think that's already been brought up, cost sharing for the study would be half and half, 50% federal, 50% non-federal, and there's an opportunity for some of that to be in kind. So if the value of tasks that would be done, if the local entity wanted to do those could be creditable towards the non-federal share. There's a little question, a little bit. So that's the study phase. On the construction phase, our normal cost sharing 65-35. This is a specifically authorized study. Did have a little bit of interesting thing. It says to the beneficiaries. So there's a little. Anyway, we would have a little bit of work to do as we finalize our document. Does that mean like the hydropower industry might pay for part of it? How does it? If we were able to do things that would extend the life and the benefits to those other authorized purposes, how might that go in even them funding some of those things? So that's not exactly all figured out. The guidance, the legislation we got wasn't maybe just super, every last detail of that clear. And our own implementation guidance leaves a little bit of that to question. So that's something the report itself would have to address is how it's proposed to be funded. But anyway, that's a little clarification on that. So probably one thing that's of interest to everybody is how do you start a general investigation study? And so it looks like 6 steps. The first 3 are pretty much all can be done concurrently, but there are some things. So I mentioned, for one thing, there has to be a problem that somebody wants solved. And so in this case, we're pretty clear on that, right? We have a sediment issue in a reservoir. So that one, we're done with that. And normally, maybe about the same time, a non-federal sponsor would contact the Corps, and either together or separately, we can sort out which study authority it falls under. And so, the fact is, sometimes the study authority doesn't exist, and so then that's actually working with members of Congress or the administration to get an authority passed. So we're pretty good. We're well on our way, I guess, through the first 3 steps. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But so those are going. But so then what happens next? To actually, even if you have an authority that exists, it still has to get picked to get funding in a given year. And so that's really the next part. The Corps has a national budget ranking process. But so basically, we're putting together projects and ideas and saying these are items that people are seeking funding for. And then that goes basically through the administration and Congress, and then certain projects are picked. One of the things that has been the case in recent years that next to the last box, it says allocation of New Start authority and funding. There have been times where we've been limited to start only 6 studies a year. So that's kind of been the case the last few years. There's been some limitations. There is a little bit to that in the sense that if you've studied an area before, it might actually be considered not a new start. So we have a couple of details still on 1179 since there have been lots of studies in the past. Do we really need a new start? I've been pursuing that, and I still have a few more people to talk with at our headquarters. But anyway, so that's a question though that has to be resolved. Are we the study that gets, or is this the study that gets picked in a given year? But those are some of the sorts of things that we work with, and then once it is picked, it gets funding. I mean, that's kind of the funding decision, and then you're off and signing cost sharing agreements and moving out. I know there's more complicated than I wish it was, but it's kind of the way it is. I don't know if there was any quick questions on that. Otherwise, we'll keep going through this, but and we certainly can loop back to it. So that was general investigations. One of the things we just wanted to bring up is there are other authorities. So one of the technical assistance authorities that we have on the books is called Planning Assistance to States. And it just allows us to provide technical assistance. You can do the studies. The study would need a follow-on phase, like for this, if it was happened to be applied here, we could do some of the technical work and technical discussions that Paul's discussed, but to actually implement it, we would have a follow-on piece to look at the details of that under 1179A, for example. But it's wide-ranging. One of the advantages is it is an ongoing and funded program. So every year there's been appropriations for planning assistance to states. There's funding for this year, and so I'm just bringing that up as an option that maybe allows moving out even a little quicker. But anyway, that's an opportunity as well. And then I listed a few examples, but we do about 10 planning assistance to states, or have 10 ongoing each year, and it gives or takes. But examples, we might be helping people with, like in the Omaha area, we're looking at stream degradation issues, a little different take on sediment. It's rapidly disappearing from some areas where they might not want it. They would rather have the dirt material around their sewage pipes and things, and different things with like floodplain mapping and those sorts of things. But there's potential for even efforts like this to be done under planning assistance to states. And then this is really more just kind of to round out. The other thing is we do have small projects that are allowed to be studied and constructed. I just kind of have that for reference, but we can do everything from small flood risk studies to restoration, and we do have a tribal partnership program that's pretty wide-ranging as well to work with tribes. And there's funding limits. I'll probably keep moving through this unless there's questions. I just kind of wanted to include kind of those range of ways that we can come about projects. One thing that's recent, 2016, the same Water Resource Development Act that passed 1179A that talked about sedimentation on the Missouri River included some changes in the way cost sharing is provided for tribes. There'd been some provisions for, I think, Puerto Rico and other parts, Pacific Islands and things of the U.S., and it got extended to tribes, and basically it allows some improved cost sharing for tribes. In particular, it excludes the first $455,000 of study costs, and so if a study was $455,000 or less, there wouldn't be a requirement. It would be 100% federal. If it was over that, the cost over $455,000 would be cost shared. So yeah, if it was $555,000 study estimate, then that would be $50,000 for each entity, or well, it'd be $550,000. The Corps would pay the first $455,000, but the other would be split. So anyway, on construction, it's even a little better deal for the way that it's applied is you first do the cost, the shares, and then the $455,000 subtracted from the tribal share. And then there is a provision, Section 1129, provided the same kind of cost sharing to our planning assistance to states program. So we talked a little bit with Sandy about all the different options.
Is this only available for one tribe per project, or separate tribes can this to the same project?
So I've pursued that a little bit because it's a good question. Is if we had more than one tribal entity, would that be for each in its total? As I've got it so far, I'm still kind of finishing up discussions with our headquarters office. But as I'm tracking it right now, it's an allowance for tribes, and that would be whether there's one or three or two or however many tribes would be on a particular project. But it's not limited. I mean, a tribe could do several different studies and still have that apply, but it doesn't. As I'm tracking it right now, there's no additional feature where each tribe would be able to bring $455,000.
And there's the tribe is not limited to just one request.
No, that's what I meant to be saying. Like, yeah.
On multiple projects.
So, yeah.
How might that fit into like a multi-stakeholder effort?
So we'll come back to that, but so that one of the questions was that Sandy and I have been visiting about is just the variety of ways we might do this. It certainly is a partnership effort, and that makes sense and needs to be. One of the questions that has not been totally answered for me, I asked, well, what if you have a tribe or a couple tribes and counties and cities and things? It's not fully resolved if this would apply or not. So that probably got a little policy and law interpretation to be done. But anyway, we're in the midst of asking those questions.
Since this is new, I don't know that it has been attempted to be applied in that way. Our understanding is whatever has been asked for a project, it has been fully with a single lead sponsor as a tribe to get this exemption.
Right. So the easy answer was if it's a tribe or a couple of tribes, it definitely applies. If it's a mixed entity, there's a little more homework to be done. And like Paul said, I think it's true with just the timing of it and our implementation guidance. I don't think it's actually been fully vetted or sorted out yet. But we're happy to help do that. And so then really this leads into the next question is we've been talking about how would sponsorship work? What are the options? And there's quite a few options. So as we've done studies and projects, oftentimes, and not surprisingly, sometimes it's a single sponsor, and so we can definitely do that. We can work with an individual, state, county, city, tribe, or in non-governmental organizations can be sponsors. As it relates to 1179 and several of our other programs, a non-governmental organization would need to partner and at least have the support of a affected local government. So that's kind of that next group of text. So, if MSAC, for example, were to sponsor 1179 study on their own, at least one other entity that has is a local government would sign on or support, sign a letter of support for them to be the sponsor. And so then, and then I got the single and multiple tribes, could be sponsors, and they would get the benefit of the exclusion that we just talked about. And then we've also had studies that have been done in various combinations. So one of the things is we sign an agreement, a study cost sharing agreement. So there needs to be some decision at some point. Our district commander would sign that along with the sponsor, and that can be, again, one entity or a group of entities. But if it's a group of entities, that's just there's a practical logistical thing of that document would go around through however many people are going to sign it. But so we've done both. So that's an option for multiple parties signing it. One thing that's just worth highlighting, or it's a fact, is if three entities sign on a cost sharing agreement and one of them backs out, the other two are left holding that non-federal responsibility. So in other words, the liability for that share, stays with whoever the signatories are. So anyway, so you kind of want to work together on that, getting ready to sign it or know that that's part of it. We've also had kind of where multi-parties are interested in working together, but ultimately they decide we're going to have one entity sign it, and then we're going to sign a separate agreement. However formal or informal that is. That could be a legal document or it could be much more informal. But then on the side, they sort out, hey, we're each providing different percentages or types of support to it. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to get, so anyway, there's lots of options, but those are things that we've ran across.
So on the cost of the study, is there a limit or a cap? Or when these parties sign up for this, is it, this is what I'm thinking going to be, but there's an open-ended.
Yeah, so I put a slide in on what are some of the provisions that are in our feasibility cost sharing agreements, because it's what are we signing on for? So the cost sharing agreement's going to do a couple of things. It's going to talk about the authority. It's going to have a cost estimate. It's going to talk about the percentages and who's responsible for what. There's responsibilities of record keeping. One of the realities is cost generally don't change too much, but there is provisions for that, and so costs could increase a little bit. A couple of things we know is it's not to go over $3 million, and we're not thinking it'll even be close to that. But so if changes were to occur, there's a notification process that everybody knows about it. And then certainly one of the things that's in all our cost sharing agreements, there's a termination clause as well. So either party can end the agreement. But so that's at least a part of the protections. So we're gonna have a cost estimate that we all agree to. There's the chance that costs, some scope thing might come up that there's a decision, let's add that, or something that might increase the cost a little bit. As it would, if that were to be the case, we said, hey, we want to pick up this extra piece. That's another $75,000. That'll be split. That would be allowed. It's subject to all the parties, agreeing with that. But so I think one of the things that I wanted to mention, though, there is a termination clause for a local sponsor as you sign that agreement. If for whatever reason something changes and you want to be done with the agreement or a preliminary stage and you go, all right, we know enough now, or whatever those cases might be, there is a way to stop the study. And the responsibility then would just be to pay that 50% share up to wherever that termination request occurs. I think I had just one other thing I was going to. And then so sort of just the question of how could sponsorship work. under 1179A, what are kind of the next steps? So certainly one of them, and these are probably concurrent pieces, is a letter of intent. That starts our process, is we're able to communicate with our headquarters and say, hey, there's a request, and that starts working its way through that, kind of the internal agency ranking. Decision on sponsorship, that's probably in particular a key thing for the local sponsor. We can actually get a letter of intent from one entity or 5. It's like you don't have to have every last detail of how you might want to do the sponsorship figured out before a letter of intent can be sent. And it's non-binding, but like I said, it basically puts us on notice and helps start that clock of sorting through the budget ranking process a little bit. Certainly one of the things with 1179A as a specifically authorized general investigation, it's wise to, on any of these, provide justification and be thinking about working with, members of Congress or sometimes sponsor entities reach out to core headquarters, but like making people aware, basically. It's a fairly high profile thing to be one of those picked efforts that's going on in the nation, and it generally helps that people in DC are hearing are aware of it and know of its importance. But so just kind of a clarification, so on 1179A as a specifically authorized, the decision level is, goes through our core headquarters, the Office of Management and Budget weigh in, and so it happens. I mean, it's not that complicated, but that's where the decision level is. It's with entities in Washington D.C. And then, at a specific project naming, it finds its way into a budget with a specific name or amount. And so that can happen. The president's budget comes out a year in advance in February, so there's a chance to be named in that, for the following year. But there is oftentimes there's some extra dollars that Congress has appropriated under general investigations. Those can be assigned in a work plan. But so one of those two places, your project has to show up and to be a specifically authorized. The planning assistance to states route, same sort of thing with letter of intent, decisions on sponsorship. The justification that we work is really that program has ongoing funding, and basically it's kind of farmed out a little bit to we have a division headquarters that we work with, so it's a level down, and we sort through projects. It's a more informal ranking and funding allocations through that planning assistance to states program. They're not, formally named out in quite the same way. And one of the things, if there was interest in proceeding under this first phase under planning assistance to states, 1179A would still be very relevant. So planning assistance to state could be a way to look at kind of the first broad piece. But then if technology was identified that was, the sediment collectors or dredging or some piece was going to be implemented, there would be probably either course where would be a more detailed look at the exact costs and how that technology would lay out and the benefits and costs of it. But if we use planning assistance to states for the first broad piece, that could still proceed under a follow-on piece could proceed under 1179A. Hopefully that didn't sound as bureaucratic as it probably did. Or, I don't know if people are following that generally or have questions for us. But just the way that we're set up, the authorities we've been given, there is obviously a little bit of a process to it, right? So there's a request that has to happen. Under any of our authorities, there's a little bit of a budget ranking process since we're a national organization. It's sorting out what are all the project ideas, what's the compelling nature of each, and which ones get picked. Those sorts of things have to happen.
Would the local stakeholders find out whether headquarters would look at 1179A as a new start before the cost share agreement?
Right. So one of the big questions, I think maybe you noticed that because that was one of my steps in the little 6 steps was, if it's a new start, which means it's a totally new effort, it actually has to, there's a limit to those, how many there are. And as I'm understanding it, there's probably going to be 6 this coming year. And so that's a pretty high bar to get to be one of the 6 out of all the different things going on in the nation. The question we've been asking and we've been talking about, and so I just don't have the final answer back, but we've been pursuing discussions, is because we've done previous studies, is it a resumption of previous core work, which adds some flexibility? And so we're working that process, and we should know that pretty soon. I mean, we're working that, but I don't have a a final answer on that today. And I think that would play into it. I mean, I think if we knew we were a new start, I would probably steer you even a little bit more directly towards planning assistance to states, because it can be a little bit arduous to get one of those 6 new starts.
That could delay it maybe 18 months or...
Oh, yeah. I mean, so we're getting our budget, that appropriations we talked about. The work plan will be getting worked on probably in the next 3 months or so. And we're a little bit behind that. There's a lot of other named projects out there seeking funds, so it'd be good to get a letter of intent in, but we're a little bit behind, consideration, especially if it had to be a new start. And so it would be about another year again before other new starts would be considered, if it has to be, if it falls in that new start category.
How important are our elected officials in this process? Can our senators give somebody a push and that makes a difference, or do they have any input as far as who is the 6 projects that get picked? I'm just wondering if it's a political process as well as an organizational process.
Probably in reality, it's probably a little bit of both, I think. I mean, so we do budget rankings for all our different business lines. This one's a little interesting because we have a flood risk management business line, and normally what the rankings are based on is population at risk and onset of flooding, and we have an ecosystem business line, and we have water supply. This one falls a little bit in an interesting niche in the sense that it's a little bit different type of study, but we would put forward, jointly, we would be talking about all the reasons that sediment management matters. And so just so you know, I mean, one of the things our agency does value this type of study, right? So as we've talked to our core headquarters, they're aware of it, but it doesn't necessarily fall in an absolute normal box, I think, for us. So I guess the one thing I would say is our agency does budget ranking. I think it never hurts if our agency or leadership are hearing from members of Congress, local leaders, that it matters, right? Because there's lots of things going on in D.C., so at times more attention goes to the ones that people hear about. So I wouldn't underestimate the value of, those entities, pushing on that or weighing in. So,
One thing, and I think you guys understand it, that to have these counties in this area and these cities and villages, $500 to the village in Niobrara is big bucks. And I know it gets lost in the shuffle sometimes. People think, well, big government, if it happens, it doesn't, it's good. If it doesn't happen, well, that's the way it goes. But to these people, this is a significant, and this coalition that we've kind of got together is a significant process. And we're pretty proud that we were able to get these many interested people involved in it. And we sure hope you understand the importance of all these stakeholders getting in on this.
No. I mean, we go to a lot of meetings, even, right, all different sized communities and things. This is a great turnout, and we appreciate it. And one of the things I think our agency does value, which is good, right, just good practical things, is the more local support there is for projects, it definitely helps. And definitely having people be on the same page, pulling for the same project really can help. I think part of what I was just sharing, in your question, I think gets at making sure that message is getting to DC is helpful too, right? And you can use a variety of ways to do that. But I mean, our agency and our agency leadership values where people are coming together at all levels. And so I think, what you're doing definitely demonstrates that. Trying to think what other things. I think, Paul, maybe we talked a little bit about this. I think the more we've talked with Sandy over the last few weeks, probably almost regardless, I think we see it kind of as two, whether you call it 2 phases of a study or 2 parts, but I think there's an initial look at broadly at all the different, kind of technologies, methods, and then and hopefully, I mean, seeing the benefits of one of those or a couple of those that'd be more promising, there would be a follow-on detailed look at those to actually move towards implementation of them.
Yeah, based on what 1179 says you shall do in the plan, I don't think it's cost effective to shall do all of those things for 20 different management actions, 17 of them that don't really work here. So if we kind of parse that into a technical feasibility analysis and say, we looked at everything, and here are the few that have traction, and then you go through economic and environmental and practical and the final technical on those, it's a smarter use of money. I don't need an economic analysis on something that's just not going to work, right? That's useless effort in that point. So I think that's where Brad and I were kind of, instead of scoping this thing gigantic and doing one gigantic 1179, how can we stage this to say, because it doesn't talk about specifically in their screening, but that's exactly what we're talking about here. We're doing a technical screening of alternatives first, so that we don't have to invest a lot of extra effort into things that, like, as we said, turbidity current venting, right? We don't have the river for it, we don't have the sediment for it, we don't have the energy for it. So that's a paragraph of why that won't work, not 3 weeks of engineering time to do calculations on why it won't work. We have plenty of proof that it won't, so let's not spin our wheels there. So that's kind of where we get on that with a two-phase type of effort.
One other thing that I think might be important to people here and how we pursue this, just what level of stakeholder engagement do you anticipate in this process? I mean, it's not these stakeholders are contributing a certain amount of money and then a couple years later you tell us what you came up with.
No. You don't get a different number of votes with some dollars you put into the system, right? At this point, as we talked, and that's one of the things we talked about, in-kind services. MSACs, we're working on this with the city of Nebraska, or city of Omaha. The coordination of the meetings, the resourcing, the putting the meetings together, that's in-kind service. That's a value that MSAC is bringing as a sponsor that can be offset by federal dollars. But yeah, as we said in the first part there, we've got a general scope from what's defined in 1179, but there needs to be a deeper dive on that, and that has to include all the, if you want to call them, the partnership of these sponsors and the public, and there has to be a continuous feedback loop on that, as we said. So there's the scoping effort, and then there's some interim products to get feedback from the sponsors, so that, as we said, we don't go down the wrong road. We have it's not unfair to accuse us of we're the government, we're here to help kind of process we had a while ago, where we disappear and then we show up in 3 years with a giant voluminous report. I hope we're well past that, and in most of these planning studies, we have almost continuous feedback cycle loops.
Right.
On those.
Yeah,
We're asking for input from the stakeholder group.
No, and I think there'd probably be a couple different ways that goes, but like generally we meet with our sponsors on a regular basis throughout to give updates, and so, I mean, that's a little bit, you guys will maybe be sorting that all out, exactly who all is a sponsor, but
into the budget and all of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
With
So those can
Omaha,
be.
we have monthly check-ins, and then we have 3 or 4 major feedback loops throughout the process, so we don't get to the end and they say, well, that's not the product we wanted, type of thing. So.
Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, that can be on an ongoing basis, and we can put that into the scope of whether that's bi-monthly meetings or what monthly meetings, or with part of the group,
Right,
and then
every morning.
yeah, yeah.
So.
This is, I guess, probably more for Mark and Sandy, but referring to your opening remarks, Mark, is MSAT contemplating or ready to, if nobody else does, take the lead in doing this letter and being the lead organization, or are you just trying to get everybody together and then there's going to be another step where some additional organization is formed, some legal entity that complies with the Corps'
Sponsor, yeah, local sponsorship.
Well, thankfully, I think we're kind of past that hump, because the city of Yankton has agreed to be the letter of intent or primary sponsor, lead sponsor entity. And then the idea is to come up with the supporting resolutions from the other stakeholders indicating that it's this group effort. And MSAC can act as kind of the coordinator of the stakeholders, and there'd be another agreement that would be agreed upon with all the stakeholders just as to the operation. I don't think it needs to be real complicated. We don't want it to be too cumbersome. But say if MSAC were to, I mean, it's just kind of the details of the whole thing. The money could be contributed to the Corps right away, or it could be put in a fund that MSAC would distribute as it's needed. Those types of things that would be agreed upon by the stakeholders. But that's kind of what we're seeing, and maybe some of the city of Yankton people could elaborate. But MSAC's really making an effort to find all the pieces to the funding puzzle, I guess, for the local cost share.
Sandy, I think the intent is that MSAC will stay involved, heavily involved in it. It's just that you have to have a governmental entity that's a pass-through for this, or you can't be involved, you can't get it at all. And the city of Yankton has stepped up and agreed to be that governmental entity, just like you would on a grant, for economic development or something. We've had three of them in Yankton in the past few years. And they're a pass-through. They are not guaranteeing it or anything, but it will act as the vehicle.
But to your point, if the city of Yankton is the lead organization and they sign the agreement, you go ahead, the city of Yankton's on the hook for half of 455 or half of 500 or whatever this cost of the study ends up being, and then it's this mechanism that MSAT works with Yankton and all these other communities to lock them in to the guarantee and that sort of thing. So,
Right.
just as,
I mean, we can take, through the planning process, we can take multiple sponsors. There can be multiple, I guess our, preference wasn't that it was 85 sponsors and us, that we had. If it was the city of Yankton as the lead, or if they've written a letter to MSAC and MSAC takes that lead with that and coordinates all of that. But it can be done either way.
Yeah. No, and maybe just to kind of go over that, probably our general preference is it's a little easier, right? To have one person signing everything, but it can go either way. But there'd be some protections for Yankton signs on, and the agreement says, hey, it's estimated $400 and some $1,000, 200 and 200 or whatever. We actually don't proceed with our work till we have matching funds. So the first $10,000 we spend, it'll be 5,000 local contributions, 5,000 from the Corps. If for some reason things started to not go forward, or Yankton wasn't getting contributions from other entities, you can stop, and all we have to do is balance the book. So it's not quite like Yankton signed on and, hey, regardless of what anybody else does, they owe $200,000 to the Corps of Engineers. So that's probably the reason why I put that slide in there, just so people know some of those mechanics.
We can't spend out of balance on the cost share. If we're going to do $10,000 of work, we have to have $5K of federal support to match the $5K of the sponsor, and we just can't spend the sponsor's money. If we have no more federal share, then we're on a pause until we can get an appropriation for that in the next year's budget, or whatever the source may be.
but now the study though, you estimate, and then do you get your half of the
all
money
at once
authorized, or then you have to go back every year or because this study's going to take, maybe it laps over 3 years. Three fiscal years.
We lay a budget with it too, right? So we've got a total value, and we itemize all those items. This task takes this many hours, and it goes from September 1st to December 31st, and I work on it, and Brad works on it, and it costs this many dollars. And as we lay those out, then they look at it. In the fiscal year, you plan to execute this much of the project. And so we attempt, not guarantee, attempt to get our federal share of that to execute that part of the project in the fiscal year, and then we get the next allocation in the next year. And there have been studies where that stream is not perfectly reliable.
Yeah. But there's been a big movement. In the past, the Corps with Congress, with the administration, has really tried to streamline our commitment to projects. Part of the reason that New Start process has gotten tough is that we used to have a whole bunch of studies going on, and they were all very lightly funded, and they were stretching over, even a decade or whatever. Now, part of if you get to be picked as a New Start, or again, like even now, just the way the budget process is working, there's a lot more commitment to say, hey, if we're starting this, we're going to finish it. We're going to try to provide reliable funding. But I've been with the Corps over 20 years, and in my early days, oftentimes we were working on studies and getting a trickle of funds, and they were no one was real satisfied, and that's not maybe 100% solved, but it largely is. But we wouldn't ask for all the money necessarily. We'd be getting some allocation, $80,000 for the next year or some amount, and we wouldn't ask for more than that. So we would ask our sponsor to contribute on that same rate that we would be getting.
The sponsor will never have to contribute faster than the plan or the federal government can provide their half of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Don, do you have a question back there?
In the applicant's review that takes place within the Corps, is there any mathematical advantage in the ranking system for an applicant that's a sole applicant versus several applicants, or sponsors, I should say?
I haven't heard that being used as one of the criteria ever, but so I'm not aware of anything with that.
Yeah. I would think from our standpoint that if the dollars are there, it doesn't really matter if they're from 5 applicants or 1.
Yeah, our biggest questions kind of ranking wise is like if we have an idea and we don't have a letter of intent, it's really not getting considered. And then at some point, once there's interest or we're allowed to go sign a cost sharing agreement, then there's a lot of emphasis, is there a signed cost sharing agreement, whether that was signed by 1 or 5 or 10 entities. That's not ever, I've never been asked that anyway. It's but I've definitely been asked, is there a signed cost sharing agreement? And that can help us get the funds.
I should just add too that although Yankton has indicated that it can be the primary sponsor, that doesn't preclude another entity from joining them.
Oh yeah.
That was my question, Sandy. Being a lawyer to this process, I assume that it's going to end up being a bit like the United Way. That even though the signs on the dotted line, the 10 or 12 fiscal partners that contribute to the big score.
Right.
But these partners are not jointly and severally liable for the match?
I think that's actually the words that they are, right? So if some entity disappeared, whoever's left on that signature line is responsible, but it's only up to the point we're at, right? So then you'd hope to never get to that point. The remaining entities could always terminate, but if they didn't, the remaining people that have signed on are going to do their best, are going to need to come up with a non-federal share.
Liability if the project is going to go to conclusion.
So once you.
Relevant to the ranking process.
Yeah, it's just a matter of practical reality.
None of that information goes into the ranking. The ranking process is, what business lines it is, new starts, relevance, interest, and as we said, who's calling who, type of thing. But there is identification. There is the one check, kind of, I think that's the advantage, is that the application says there is a signed federal cost share agreement. That does significantly improve its chances. How many people there are writing checks on that is irrelevant.
Yeah.
And maybe as far as termination, if there's a secondary agreement, say MSAC or the city of Yankton jointly is coordinating the contributions, they'd likely be terminating to us rather than to you. Does that make sense?
Oh, if you had multiple entities?
Yeah, and it's a secondary agreement where,
Right, yeah. So using this example, the question was if someone was backing out, right, or someone was getting off the bus here. So if everybody's all signed on, I think we have provisions that allow for that, but everybody else would be fully responsible. If it was, Yankton had signed on and maybe MSAC's helping coordinate the funds, that would really just be at that local level of you guys going, okay, so-and-so's, they're out or they're not going to be able to give next year's amount. That would just be handled at that level.
Yeah, another question I have, and I really don't mean to put you on the spot, Larry, but could you just give us a sense of what the interest is from your tribe and maybe the others? Because there's that provision that if there is a tribal involvement, at the commitment level, then there's more money available, or the numbers change. And you don't have to answer, but if you guys could kind of maybe have a sense of how you're thinking about being involved in this process.
Yeah, I think overall our issue is, obviously we're late to the game here a little bit, we're playing catch up. And part of that's just because before we weren't on the river itself, but we will be here in a month. And how does that affect, because I know some of those conversations were already being known. So we're catching up to that, but also just seeing, because of our status, what can we bring to the table? And so we're really just still trying to figure that out. The tribal specific aspects to this will be of importance for us. So how do we work with Santee and Yankton to put something either together with the three of us or one of us? How's that going to work? Or can we do separate pieces to this? And either we know that for sure, or there's other possibilities. And so if our part is to say we're going to apply for this aspect and they apply for something different, is that allowed? And so we'll do what we can to be part of this. And we're still trying to find out if we're being asked for cash to be part of this. And for us, that's because of several projects that we have going on right now that will be difficult. So what other options are there for us to be engaged and be part of this process? We want to be part of the solution, definitely.
Larry, I think one of the things that's important, and we should, we don't want to rely on the tribes, because that number comes out, it would pay for what we anticipate. But what we're doing is we're going to try and ask for maybe that waiver for a portion of your portion, not bigger than what everybody else is giving. So we don't want to take advantage of what you're offering. We want to have you help and be a member as equal as everybody else is. And I understand, Larry, we've got some things to work out with some things we've talked about before, as one of which is, as we discussed this afternoon in our meeting, is the fracking sand. I know that gets brought up and I cringe. So that's going to get taken care of this afternoon. We also, one other thing you should know, and it'll be real quick, is MSAC is looking into hiring consultants to help us with this process. None of us are any experts. The Corps does a great job. It's not that we don't trust, but we want to make sure that we understand what's happening and have somebody that can speak to us on a regular basis on what's going on, maybe from our advantage point. But I think that then, and we've talked a little bit about that with you guys, and you'll all know him. We haven't got that signed yet, but you'll know him when we do.
Is there more consideration if the tribe would be the sponsor, or rather than the city of Yankton?
Well, so like I was sharing, and that was that slide back here, this 11-19, and it is new, but we're applying that on a project at Lower Brule right now, and so that's one of the first times we've used that, and it's covering the cost of that study. So the one thing I know for a fact today, talking to our headquarters, is if a single tribe or a couple tribes, like for example the Ponca and the Santee, like either or both, if they put in for a study request, we understand this to apply. It would be a waiver of the first $455,000. So anyway, that's the fact I know. We are asking how that would work if it's with a group of entities, and so it seems like it would apply, but it takes legal interpretations and all those sorts of details. So we're in the midst of finding out back on that, how that might go.
This might not directly apply to 1179, but with like continuing authorities program, one reason why MSAC didn't pursue that for sediment collectors was that once it's constructed, then the local entity is responsible for operating and maintaining it for the future. And I think that's one of the things that's a little more vague in 1179, because you're at some point going to see who the project beneficiaries are. And I don't know, whether who the project beneficiaries are, do they all have to be signed on at the beginning? It doesn't really sound like it, but
No,
people who are engaging in the study to think that they're going to end up paying for the implementation phase, I guess is.
So I think a couple of things, so one, I think the first phase, there isn't an O&M follow-on component, but when you, say we find a technology or a thing that wants to be pursued all the way to implementation, there needs to be an implementation plan, because operations and maintenance will be a non-federal sponsor responsibility. That's is under most our authorities. Now, 1179 is a little bit more vague because it brings in project beneficiaries, and so I think that's something that report, if we were writing the report to implement a specific thing, it would need to handle implementation, and specifically it would need to handle who the beneficiaries are and a concept of if that applies to them, and again, if it was to be applied to other purposes, well, they better be part of that study and understanding of it as well.
I think one of the other wild cards there is that if it's a modification to the project, we haven't gone down that road. A lot of these technologies are things that are built into dams now that aren't built into Gavins Point. And so if that's something that's obviously a very expensive project and such, but clearly the O&M for a modification to the dam can't be on the sponsor. There's a fundamental problem right there. And so that we haven't gone down that road. We just don't know the answer to that one.
Good point. It's likely solution specific, and and it really isn't. I've read that guidance several times and the legislation several times, so we got some stuff to figure out. But that would be part of the study process of sorting out the follow-on details. But
It could be a wide range of things. Like if it was trying to stop erosion on someone's bank, it might be more of a local landowner.
Right. There's certainly a combination of things here. We just have to rank which ones we get the most bang for the buck type of thing.
Maybe one thing to add, signing these agreements for study phases does not put anybody on the hook for operations, for implementation. So there'd be a separate agreement, and that would be really clearly figured out.
With that agreement, we're only bound to the completion of whatever that scoped study is, or whatever scoped it is. And then when that's done, if it goes to implementation because we're going to build X and do Y, that's a completely new agreement. So nobody's obligated after the study part that they signed up to support.
Just to wrap up here, this line of questioning, you mentioned that there was a agreement or some sort of structure that you used in
Lower rule.
Are there any documents or model agreements or anything that would be public that could be shared or accessed so people could look at it and see what kind of language there is there, or is this brand?
It's kind of brand new also. It's kind of brand new. So
with this 19 exemption.
I just bring it up that it's out there. I mean, we're doing it, and we're working with our core headquarters and their attorneys and stuff, and we're applying it. And just saying, I guess using that as an example.
The better pathway might be tribal interaction on that side of stuff instead of, because we're not can't release any of the tribe's documents for that kind of thing. But there may be something that the lower rule.
Yeah, no, but
willing to share.
Well, I was going to say, but by and large, I think it's really simple. So when we would sign a feasibility cost sharing agreement, if this applied, that would be in the feasibility cost sharing agreement. It would cite this authority, and then if that total cost was below it, it would show the shares of whatever. If it was under that, it'd be X amount federal and for zero for the non-federal as it would, again, apply in that situation.
Our DC attorney's looking at this to see how it would fit us and how we can work with this. We just haven't got an answer back on that yet. And we're going to reach out to Lower Rural too. But I guess the question I would have, I know everybody, this has been talking about equitable share. If it comes out that this takes care of, you're saying this might cover most of the initial study. Are you saying that it has to be equitable share, or even if we all come together as a coalition, if the tribes, whether it's Ponca or St. Pete, that do this, or we have an MOU together and go after this together, which I don't see as being a problem. If that ends up covering this issue, is that allowable for the group? Or that's for the...
So that's what we're tracking, right? And I mean, if like, so example, instead of Yankton, if the Ponca tribe signed on as the sponsor, this is, and we can do our final checking, but I would understand that this would apply, and then there might not be a non-federal cash requirement that needs to be come up with. The funny thing is that it just feels kind of interesting in the sense that I really appreciate all the partnership work going on, and sometimes there's good that comes from that. But that's what my understanding is right now, is that could actually cover the non-federal share.
Because if that does, and y'all want to just give us some money, I'm sure St. Pete.
Yeah, we didn't hear. That's a partnership.
Yeah. Right? That's on the third party agreement.
That over tomorrow.
Yeah. You guys take care of that across the street. But yeah, we would have an agreement with whoever the lead is for the partnership, and however the partnership establishes their shares or their resourcing. It comes to us as one face of the partnership that is providing the cost share, or using 1119 as the exemption.
Right.
For it.
Would it, I guess maybe another scenario would be if the tribes are willing to do that, if somehow they loop MSAC into it and we provide letters of support and so forth, and somehow make it recognized as a multi-effort, and maybe, I don't know, I mean, there's just a whole range of things to think of. If maybe there's a fund started to complete the study, or to come up with, if there's a change order or something, then the other entities can help fund that, or, I mean, there's a whole...
Yeah, I don't know, could the tribe under this write the same type of letter that the city of Yankton has, that says, we're the lead support here, and SAC is the coordinator of the partnership? We could follow up.
No, we can follow up and ask more detailed questions about it, but
because like you said, this is the only 1179 on the table right now. Wyoming has not called for the legislation they put in there, and like you say, that's the first 1179 we've done, or 1119 with the
right.
So we're
So anyway, that was
questions to figure out.
It's certainly worth considering, right, or thinking out, and we are pursuing understanding how tribal participation with a group of sponsors would work as well. So that, anyway, we'll chase that down more, but I think that's obviously there's some advantage there. And then the other one that I just maybe reiterate was 1179, great authority. It's made for this. If we do run into the fact that it is going to be a new start, I would encourage you to continue to think about that planning assistance to states, which would still allow you to do this study, and probably in a lot of ways has some practical advantages of getting funds a little bit faster. So I mean, just to have an open mind about that. But anyway, that's kind of my advice of working on a lot of these. That it's nice when it's just one exact thing, but we have a couple of things in play that will help sort out as well. All right.